This Texas legend tells of finding rope and towering oaks. Jasmine Crockett uttered these words, each one heavy, reminiscent of a prosecutor presenting a written confession. She didn't have to look. The atmosphere in the room was palpable. Upon finishing, she lowered the paper, eyeing Chip Roy, whose crossed arms and set jaw attempted to project confidence but mainly signaled silent stress. "Mr. Roy, was that your statement?" Roy leaned into his microphone. "Yes, and I stand by every word. I was referring to true justice, Congresswoman, not the kind where we coddle criminals. Something this body needs to focus on." A few attendees nodded, reflecting Roy's familiar assertive style that energized his supporters. He was not one to retreat or mince words. He doubled down. Crockett observed him like a woman watching a man venture onto thin ice. "Justice," she echoed, deliberately writing the word as if to memorize his interpretation. "You talk a lot about justice, Mr. Roy. Let's see if you truly believe in it." Roy shifted but maintained his posture. Confrontation with anyone, even leadership or Trump, was nothing new for him. He was no stranger to government shutdowns or blocking massive bills as policy chair of the Freedom Caucus. He viewed this as a performance, a way to control the narrative. What he didn't expect was Crockett changing the topic completely. On March 16, 2021, she began, a 21-year-old shooter entered 3 Atlanta spas, killing 8 people, including 6 Asian women. She held up a paper. "Sunun Chong, Park Hyun Jong, Grant Suna Kim, Yang Aoi Xiao, Jen Dao Yufong." She read each name with gravity. Silence descended upon the room. A woman in the gallery was visually moved. 2 days later, this committee held a hearing on discrimination and violence against Asian Americans, the first in decades, Crockett continued. The country was experiencing a surge in anti-Asian sentiment, with nearly 4,000 reported hate incidents that year alone. Crockett paused and said, "And your opening statement for that hearing mentioned ropes and oak trees." Roy slightly uncrossed his arms. "Congresswoman, as I've explained, I was making a broader point about justice for all victims of violence, not just the ones you mentioned, like cartel victims and victims of riots." "You pivoted," Crockett retorted, her voice even. "6 women were dead for only 48 hours, and your focus was on the border and cartels and last summer's protests. In your 5 minutes, you could have spoken about the victims, but instead you chose your own agenda and even a lynching reference." Roy responded by saying that was not, and then you invoked lynching. Crockett picked up the paper again. "Find all the rope in Texas and get a tall oak tree. Round up the bad guys. You said that in this room during a hearing on the murders of Asian Americans while their families were likely watching." She made the point personal. Congressman Ted Lieu, a military veteran, pointed out the largest mass lynching in American history was against Chinese immigrants in 1871, where 17 people were hanged. She paused. "Did you know that when you made your comment?" Roy's jaw tightened. "I was not referencing any specific historical—" "Congresswoman Grace Meng stood right there," Crockett pointed to a seat, "and said through tears, 'You don't have to put a bullseye on the back of Asian Americans across this country, on our grandparents, on our kids.'" She was visibly shaken. "Mr. Roy," her voice was breaking. "A fellow member of Congress was in pain, pleading with you to stop painting a target on her community. Did you hear her?" "I respect Congresswoman Meng, but I stand by—" "You stand by it? You put out a statement that night. Apparently some folks are freaking out. I meant it. No apologies." Crockett set the paper down. "Freaking out. Is that how you describe the anguish of Asian Americans after 6 of their women were murdered? As though their pain was an overreaction?" She paused, her voice becoming clinical and contrastingly calm. "So let me be clear. 6 Asian women were murdered. This committee convened to discuss their deaths, and you used your opening statement to romanticize the very form of violence used against people of color in this country for 200 years. And when your colleagues, Asian American community leaders and civil rights organizations told you that was wrong, you said, 'I meant it. No apologies.'" She wrote in her notebook, "That's your version of justice." Crockett let the silence linger, then leaned back and asked in an almost curious tone, "Let's talk about those old sayings in Texas, Mr. Roy." Roy straightened. "I grew up hearing—" "You grew up in Virginia," the statement landed. Roy was momentarily speechless. "You were born in Bethesda, Maryland, a D.C. suburb. You were raised in Lovettsville, Virginia, and attended the University of Virginia," Crockett detailed. "You didn't move to Texas until law school. You weren't raised on a ranch, and you didn't grow up hearing old Texas sayings around a campfire. You grew up in the D.C. suburbs." Someone in the gallery stifled a laugh. "And that saying itself, 'Find all the rope in Texas and get a tall oak tree,' that's not an old saying, is it?" Even the Texas Republican Party chairman at the time, Allen West, stated, "No one should infer hanging as a metaphor," and when pressed on the origin, you claimed it was from a Willie Nelson song. Roy's face reddened. "It's a well-known. It's from a country song about vigilante justice that critics have called a celebration of lynching. That's your source material, not Texas folklore, not frontier wisdom. A song," Crockett shrugged, "quoted by a man born in Maryland." This time the gallery couldn't hide their laughter. It was pointed and small, yet devastating, as Crockett had just exposed Roy's entire public persona as an elaborate costume in 30 seconds. Roy leaned into his microphone. "Congresswoman, I've lived in Texas for over 20 years. I've represented Texas in Congress, and I've fought for Texas." "You fought for a version of Texas that you invented, Mr. Roy," Crockett replied. "The tough-talking cowboy who quotes frontier sayings and talks about stringing up bad guys. Except the sayings aren't real. They're from country music. The cowboy isn't real. He grew up minutes from the National Mall." She looked at her folder. "And the justice you keep talking about, let's see if that's real either." She paused, letting the transition build. "Because here's what I've noticed. You use Texas like some people use a pickup truck they never take off-road. It looks good, it sends a message, but it's never actually done any work." She turned a page. "So let's look at what happened when real Texans needed real help." Chairman Nadler glanced at the clock. Crockett had plenty of time. "Let's talk about what justice looks like when real people need it." Crockett opened a new section. The humor was gone. The Bethesda revelation had been a precise scalpel, but what came next was a hammer. "I want to talk about a specific moment in your career, Mr. Roy. A moment that I think tells us everything we need to know about how you define justice." Roy crossed his arms again, a posture that likely felt defiant to him but looked defensive. He was preparing to take a hit. On May 24, 2019, the Senate had just passed a $19.1 billion disaster relief package with an overwhelming 85 votes in favor and only 8 against. Both of your state's Republican senators, John Cornyn and Ted Cruz, your former boss, voted for it. She laid out the scope. The bill would have sent $4 billion to Texas following Hurricane Harvey, a storm that killed over 100 people, displaced more than 30,000, and caused $125 billion in damage, making it the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history at that point. The money had been approved by Congress over a year earlier, but it was still sitting in federal accounts, unreleased while families waited. She turned to the next page. The bill also included $900 million for hurricane-damaged Puerto Rico, where American citizens, and they are American citizens, Mr. Roy, in case that needs clarifying, had been waiting even longer. Communities across 9 states and 2 territories, from California wildfire zones to Midwestern floodplains, were depending on this money. She looked at Roy. Most of the House had already gone home for Memorial Day recess. The bill was supposed to pass with a voice vote, a simple standard procedure. Meanwhile, all it required was no objections. She paused. One person objected, you. Roy shifted. The bill had no spending offsets. It added $19 billion to the national debt without— Hurricane season was starting in 1 week, Mr. Roy. She stopped. Families in Houston had been living in FEMA trailers for over a year. Puerto Rico was still rebuilding from Maria. Communities were waiting for help, and you, a single congressman, blocked it. Not in a vote, not through legislation. You just stood up in an empty chamber and said no. I was exercising my right as a member of Congress to ensure proper. You delayed the bill for 11 days? Crockett held up a printed timeline. 11 days of families wondering if help was coming. 11 days of coastal communities watching the weather forecast and knowing hurricane season had already begun. And when the bill finally came back for a vote, it passed 354 to 58. She looked at Roy. You voted against it, again. Roy leaned forward aggressively. Because the bill didn't include border funding that the president himself, so families who lost their homes in a hurricane had to wait because you wanted border wall money in a disaster relief bill. Crockett's voice was flat. That's your position. People are drowning and you're haggling over a wall. That is a gross oversimplification. Even Ted Cruz voted for this bill, Mr. Roy. Even John Cornyn. Both Texas Republicans looked at a bill that sent $4 billion to their own state and said, yes. She leaned back. But you, the man who talks about justice for Texans, who quotes old Texas sayings, who wraps himself in the Lone Star flag every chance he gets, you looked at Texas families in FEMA trailers and said, not until I get my wall. Roy's hands were flat on the table, pressing down as though to keep something from rising. You know what the people in Houston didn't have, Mr. Roy? Spending offsets. They didn't have offsets for the water in their living rooms. They didn't have offsets for the mold growing up their walls. They didn't have offsets for the year they spent waiting for Congress to remember they existed. Crockett's voice hardened. But you had a talking point about the national debt. I'm sure that kept them warm. Someone in the press gallery exhaled audibly. Chairman Nadler didn't reach for his gavel. Roy saw his opening. He sat up straighter, and when he spoke, his voice had that practiced edge. The Ted Cruz protege, the former federal prosecutor, the man who'd once stared down a government shutdown from the inside. Congresswoman, I'll tell you what I told every reporter who asked me about that vote. I grew up watching Washington spend money it didn't have. I watched both parties add trillions to the national debt and hand the bill to our children. When that disaster bill came to the floor without a single spending offset, without border security provisions the president requested, without a recorded vote where every member had to go on the record, I exercised the responsibility that my constituents sent me here to exercise. I said no. Not because I don't care about hurricane victims, but because I care about fiscal discipline, and I will not apologize for that. A few heads in the gallery nodded. It was a good answer. Practiced, principled sounding, delivered with conviction. For a moment, the room's momentum paused. Crockett let him have it. She let the nods finish. She let the moment breathe. And then quietly, Mr. Roy, do you know how much money you've helped to add to the national debt since you've been in Congress? Roy blinked. You voted for the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act extension provisions that added roughly $4 trillion to the deficit. You voted for defense spending bills that exceeded budget caps. You voted for continuing resolutions that funded the government at levels you yourself called irresponsible. She pulled out a page. When the spending benefits your priorities, defense, border enforcement, tax cuts, you find a way to say yes. When the spending helps families in FEMA trailers, suddenly you're a fiscal hawk. Roy's jaw tightened. Those are fundamentally different categories of... Hey, they're only different because the hurricane victims can't vote you out of office and the defense lobby can. Crockett set the page down. That's not fiscal discipline, Mr. Roy. That's political math. She turned back to her folder. You said at the beginning of this hearing that you believe in justice. Blocking disaster relief for your own constituents while voting for trillions in tax cuts and defense spending. Is that justice? Or is that just knowing which fights make you look good on cable news? Roy opened his mouth, closed it. The counterpunch had been absorbed, the momentum reversed. His hands went back to the table, pressing flat. You said at the beginning of this hearing that you believe in justice, Crockett said. Blocking disaster relief for your own constituents to score political points on immigration, is that justice? Roy opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I've consistently fought for responsible spending. You've consistently fought for headlines. Crockett closed the folder. There's a difference. She didn't pause this time. She moved directly into the next section, like a boxer following a body shot with a hook. No recovery time. Let's talk about children, Mr. Roy, since you bring them up a lot. Roy's eyes narrowed. Children were his rhetorical home base. Cartels abusing children, children trafficked at the border, children endangered by democratic policies. He could talk about children in his sleep. At the lynching hearing in 2021, when we were discussing the murder of Asian American women, you redirected to, and I'm quoting, cartels abusing little children. Crockett pulled out a transcript. At the Ukraine vote in 2024, when we were discussing Russian abduction of Ukrainian children, you redirected to, again quoting, children getting sold in the sex trafficking trade right here in America. She set the transcript down. Every time someone else's children are suffering, you change the subject to your children, the ones at the border, the rhetorical ones. She paused. So let's talk about what happened when actual children needed your help. Crockett pulled out a vote tally. March 19, 2024. This House voted on a resolution, House Resolution 149, condemning the illegal abduction and forcible transfer of children from Ukraine to the Russian Federation. It was symbolic. No money, no military action, just Congress saying kidnapping children is wrong. She held up the tally sheet. 390 members voted yes, 9 voted no. She looked at Roy. You were one of the 9. Roy leaned into his microphone. That resolution used the word genocide, which is a serious legal term that 20,000 children, Mr. Roy. Crockett's voice cut through his like a blade through paper. That's how many Ukrainian children Russia has forcibly transferred according to the Ukrainian government, taken from their parents, taken from their schools, their homes, their language, given Russian citizenship, placed in Russian families or government group homes, taught to forget their own names, taught to say they are Russian, taught that Ukraine doesn't exist. She pulled out another document. Some of these children were taken from orphanages in occupied territories. Some were separated from parents who had been arrested or killed. Some were lured to so-called summer camps in Russia and never sent back. Their parents are looking for them right now, Mr. Roy. Right now, as we sit here, there are mothers and fathers in Ukraine who don't know where their children are, who don't know if their children remember them, who don't know if their children are alive. The gallery was very still. I understand the gravity of. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin over these abductions, not over the war itself, over the children specifically. Putin's own Children's Rights Commissioner, that's what they call her, Mr. Roy, Children's Rights Commissioner, publicly bragged about facilitating the adoption of a Ukrainian boy into her own family. She stole a child and went on television to celebrate it. Crockett set the document down. And you voted against a piece of paper, symbolic, non-binding, costing $0, that said it was wrong. The resolution contained the word genocide, which carries specific legal. The Genocide Convention of 1948, Article 2, Section E, defines genocide to include forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. That's not my interpretation. That's the text of the convention. Russia is a signatory. What they're doing meets the definition. She paused. But even if you disagree with the word, even if you think genocide is too strong, you could have voted yes on the principle. 390 of your colleagues did. They managed to say kidnapping children is wrong without having a legal symposium about terminology. Roy's voice rose. Our country is under siege at our own border. We have our own children being. There it is, Crockett pointed at him. Right on cue. Someone mentions children being kidnapped by a dictator, and you redirect to the border, just like you did at the anti-Asian violence hearing, just like you do every single time. She leaned forward. Let me show you what that looks like from the outside, Mr. Roy, because I don't think you've ever seen it clearly. She held up 2 transcripts side by side. 2021, a hearing about the violence against Asian American women. You redirect to cartels harming children at the border. 2024, a vote about children taken from Ukraine by force. You redirect to children being exploited right here in America. 2 different years, 2 different crises, 2 different groups of victims. And both times you grabbed the nearest child rhetorically and waved them in front of the camera to change the subject. She set the transcripts down. You talk about children like they're poker chips, Mr. Roy. You put them on the table when you need to change the subject, and you sweep them off when someone else's children need help. Asian American families in pain, redirect to the border. Ukrainian children taken from their parents, redirect to the border. And then what do you do for the border children you claim to care about so deeply? You block disaster relief that would have helped their communities. You demand government shutdowns that close the services they depend on. You introduce bills you know won't pass so you can fundraise off the outrage. Roy slammed his hand on the table. I have done more for border security than anyone in this Congress. You've done more to talk about border security than anyone in this Congress. Crockett didn't flinch. There's a difference, Mr. Roy. And the children, all of them in every country, can tell. Roy's hand was still flat on the table where he'd slammed it. His face had gone from red to something darker, more compressed, like heat building behind a closed valve. For a moment, he looked like he might slam the table again, or stand up, or walk out. He did none of those things. He just sat there, radiating something that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite fear, but lived somewhere between the two. You said you care about children deeply, Crockett continued, her voice dropping to something almost gentle, and the gentleness, as always, made it worse. I believe you believe that, but your voting record tells a different story. 390 members of Congress looked at 20,000 kidnapped children and said, "This is wrong." Us, you and 8 others said, "Not our problem." And then you had the nerve to say on camera, on the record, "This isn't just about the children, this is about making a point." She let his own words fill the room. You're right, Mr. Roy. It was about making a point. You just didn't realize the point you were making was about yourself. Roy was breathing harder now. Not visibly, he was too disciplined for that. But there was a tightness in his chest that showed in the way his shoulders rose slightly with each breath, the way his collar seemed to press against his neck. He'd been in political fights his whole career, with Democrats, with his own leadership, with the media, but those fights had rules he understood. You attack, they attack, you counterattack, the audience scores it. This was different. Crockett wasn't fighting him, she was reading his record back to him and letting the record fight for her. The worst part was the gallery. On Fox News, the audience cheered his defiance. In town halls, his supporters whooped when he talked about rope and oak trees, but in this room, the gallery was silent in a way that felt like judgment, or worse, understanding. They understood exactly what Crockett was showing them, and they didn't need to be told what to think about it. Crockett took a sip of water. She was in no hurry. Mr. Roy, I've shown you 3 things now. Your words at the anti-Asian violence hearing, your record on disaster relief, your vote on the Ukrainian children resolution, 3 different moments, 3 different issues, 3 different groups of people who needed help. She set her water glass down. And in all 3 cases, you either made things worse or walked away. So the question is, why? Is there a principle underneath all of this? Is there something you actually believe in beyond the performance? She reached into her folder one last time. She pulled out a single sheet of paper, a transcript with one passage highlighted in yellow. I want to read you something, Mr. Roy. This is from a recording of you speaking at an event hosted by Patriot Voices in 2021. Roy's posture changed. It was subtle, a slight stiffening of the shoulders, a micro-adjustment of his hands. He knew what was coming. Crockett read slowly. Honestly, right now for the next 18 months, our job is to do everything we can to slow all of that down to get to December of 2022. She looked up. Roy's face was very still. I don't vote for anything in the House of Representatives right now. She set the transcript on the desk and placed her hand flat on top of it as though holding it in place, holding it in the room. This was 2021, Mr. Roy. President Biden had just taken office. Congress was working on infrastructure legislation, roads, bridges, broadband internet for rural communities, legislation that would have benefited your district in Texas. And you told a room full of supporters that your job, your word job, was not to govern, not to legislate, not to represent your constituents. Your job was to slow all of that down, to create, in your own words, 18 months of chaos and the inability to get stuff done. Roy shifted forward. That recording was taken out of context. I was making a strategic point about the legislative calendar and the need to prevent reckless spending. I don't vote for anything. Those are your words, not mine. Not a paraphrase, not an interpretation. I don't vote for anything in the House of Representatives right now. You said that out loud to supporters as a statement of principle. Crockett leaned back. And then you went home and told your constituents you were fighting for them. She pulled out her phone, not to show a video, just to read from a screen. This is your campaign website, Mr. Roy. Quote, Chip Roy fights every day for the hardworking people of Texas's 21st District, end quote. She set the phone down. But behind closed doors, you told a room full of donors that you don't vote for anything, that your job is chaos, that the goal isn't solutions, it's sabotage. She paused and let her voice drop. You know who suffers when Congress doesn't work, Mr. Roy? Not you. You still get your salary. You still get your health care. You still get your pension. The people who suffer are the ones waiting for disaster relief that you blocked, the ones waiting for infrastructure money that you obstructed, the ones waiting for a functioning government that you deliberately broke. Roy opened his mouth, but Crockett was already connecting the threads. So when you blocked disaster relief for hurricane victims, that wasn't about the national debt. That was your 18 months of chaos. When you voted against condemning the kidnapping of children, that wasn't about the legal definition of genocide. That was obstruction dressed up as principle. When you stood at this very dais and talked about rope and oak trees, that wasn't about justice. It was about building a brand. The tough Texas cowboy from Bethesda, Maryland, who says what everyone's thinking and does absolutely nothing to help. She paused. Except you don't say what everyone's thinking, Mr. Roy. You say what gets you on television, and then you call it justice. And then behind closed doors, you call it chaos. And then you cash the check. Roy's jaw was working, but no words came out. For the first time all hearing, the man who always had a response, always had the aggressive counterpunch, the talk radio comeback, the defiant one-liner, had nothing. Not because Crockett had destroyed his argument, but because she'd played his own voice back to him, and his own voice had destroyed it for her. Crockett glanced at the clock. She had 4 minutes left. She didn't open a new folder. She didn't pull out a new document. She just set her hands on the desk and looked at Roy the way a teacher looks at a student who has been caught cheating and is still somehow arguing about it. Mr. Roy, I've been sitting here for the better part of an hour, listening to you talk about justice, about fighting for Texans, about protecting children, about strong language and no apologies. So let me tell you what I've seen. Her voice found its rhythm, not a shout, not a whisper, but the measured cadence of a closing argument. I've seen a man who referenced lynching at a hearing for murdered women and said, I meant it. A man whose old Texas sayings come from a country song, and whose Texas roots go back to law school because he actually grew up in suburban Maryland. She paused. I've seen a man who talks about justice for Texans but single-handedly blocked $4 billion in hurricane relief for Texas families, who let people sit in FEMA trailers for 11 extra days so he could make a point about border wall funding that wasn't in the bill, who voted against the final bill even after his own party's Texas senators voted for it. Another pause. I've seen a man who talks about children every chance he gets, children at the border, children being trafficked, children in danger, but who voted against condemning the kidnapping of 20,000 children by a foreign government, who looked at a symbolic resolution that cost nothing and required nothing and said, this isn't about the children, who uses children as props when it's convenient and discards them when it's not. Her voice dropped. And I've seen a man who told a room full of donors that his job was to create 18 months of chaos, that he doesn't vote for anything, that the goal isn't governance, it's destruction, and then went back to his district and told voters he was fighting for them. She picked up her pen, set it down. That's not justice, Mr. Roy. That's performance. A very good one, I'll give you that. You've built a whole career on it. The tough guy, the maverick, the man who says what everyone's thinking and never backs down. She looked at him. But behind the performance, there's nothing. No relief for hurricane victims, no protection for kidnapped children, no legislation that actually passes, just noise, chaos, and fundraising emails. She straightened in her chair. I want to give you a chance, Mr. Roy. One question, simple. No tricks, no follow-ups. Just a yes or no. Roy leaned forward. Roy leaned. Something had shifted in his posture. A last surge of the aggressive energy that had carried him this far. When he spoke, his voice was harder than it had been all hearing, the voice of a man who decided to stop playing defense. Congresswoman, I've sat here and listened to you distort my record, mischaracterize my motives, and cherry-pick moments from a 20-year career in public service. I grew up in a family that believed in this country. I worked my way through law school. I served as a federal prosecutor. I was chief of staff to a United States senator. I've spent my entire adult life fighting for the Constitution and the rule of law. And I will not sit here and be lectured by someone who turns a policy disagreement into a character assassination. It was good. It was strong. It was in a different room, on Hannity, on War Room, at a Patriot Voices event. It would have been the knockout punch. A few people in the gallery straightened, responding instinctively to the conviction in his voice. Crockett waited. She let the conviction ring. She let the gallery absorb it. And then, when the echo had faded, she spoke quietly. Mr. Roy, nobody is questioning your career. I'm questioning one moment, one sentence, 6 women dead, and you talked about rope and oak trees. That's not a policy disagreement. That's a moral question, and moral questions deserve moral answers. The gallery settled. Roy's surge receded like a wave pulling back from shore, leaving wet sand and silence. So here's my question. Roy looked at her. His expression had shifted over the last 20 minutes from aggression to something harder to read, a kind of guarded alertness, like an animal that has realized the ground beneath it is not solid. On March 18, 2021, 2 days after 8 people were killed in Atlanta, 6 of them Asian American women, you stood at this dais and referenced lynching in your opening statement. You talked about rope and tall oak trees while the families of the dead were watching on television. She paused. Was that appropriate? Yes or no? Roy's mouth opened, his jaw worked, and for a moment something flickered behind his eyes. Not doubt exactly, but calculation. The rapid mental arithmetic of a man who has realized every possible answer leads somewhere bad. I was making a point about justice for all Americans, and I stand by. That's not yes or no. Was it appropriate? I believe that strong rhetoric about bringing criminals to justice is yes or no, Mr. Roy. Was it appropriate to reference lynching at a hearing about murdered Asian American women? The room held its breath. Somewhere in the gallery, someone's phone buzzed, and the sound was obscenely loud in the silence. Roy sat very still. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped visibly near his ear. His hands, which had been active all hearing, crossing arms, pressing the table, slamming once, were now motionless in his lap. The aggressive energy that had powered him through 100 Fox News segments and 1,000 House floor speeches had nowhere to go. It was just sitting there inside him, building pressure with no release valve. He couldn't say yes because even he knew how it would sound broadcast on every network and clipped for every platform. Congressman says it was appropriate to reference lynching at hearing about murdered Asian women. The clip would play on a loop. His opponents would use it in every campaign ad until the end of time, and he couldn't say no because he'd spent 4 years saying, I meant it, no apologies. Taking it back now would mean admitting that every time he doubled down, every defiant statement, every fundraising email that used that moment as proof of his fearlessness had been built on something he now conceded was wrong. The brand would crack. The base would sense weakness. And in the world Chip Roy had built for himself, the world where backing down was the only unforgivable sin, weakness was death. So he sat there, caught between 2 impossibilities, while the seconds stretched and the camera watched, and the room waited for an answer that couldn't come. I have always believed in strong, clear language about, you can't say it. Crockett's voice was quiet, almost sad. You can't say no because you've spent 4 years saying you were right. And you can't say yes because you know what you said was indefensible. So you're stuck, Mr. Roy, trapped between your pride and the truth. She gathered her papers and tapped them into alignment. That's not justice. That's just a man who painted himself into a corner and is too stubborn to admit the paint is still wet. She stood up. I have no further questions. The room stayed silent for a beat, then 2, then 5. Roy didn't crumble the way some witnesses do. He didn't lower his head or tremble or look at his hands. That wasn't his style. Instead, he did something that was, in its own way, more revealing. He straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and put on the expression he wore when cameras were rolling. The performance face. The one that said, I'm fine, I won, you didn't get to me. But everyone in the room had just watched him not answer a yes or no question for 45 seconds. And the performance face coming after that silence didn't look like strength. It looked like a mask being put on over a wound. Chairman Nadler cleared his throat. Does the gentleman from Texas wish to make a closing statement? Roy leaned into his microphone. I think my record speaks for itself, Mr. Chairman. From somewhere in the gallery, barely audible. That's the problem. Roy stood up, buttoned his jacket with precise, deliberate movements, picked up his papers, and walked toward the door. He walked the way he always walked, shoulders back, chin up. The stride of a man who wanted you to know he wasn't running from anything. He didn't look at Crockett. In the gallery, 2 staffers had a quiet exchange. Did he ever say it was wrong? He can't. He told everyone he meant it. Oh. So he's stuck. That's the point. The door closed behind Roy with a soft click. Crockett sat back down and reached for her water. She drank slowly, deliberately. The way someone drinks when they want to feel something ordinary after something that wasn't. The clips would start circulating within the hour, she knew that. Not the full hearing, nobody watches those, but the fragments. The moments designed to survive outside their context and still hit just as hard. The reading of the victims' names, Sunun Chong, Park Hyun-jong, grandson, Kim Yong-awa, Xiao Jiandao, Yu Fong, slowly, one by one, followed by, and your opening statement was about rope and oak trees. The moment she told a man who'd built his career on being a tough Texan that he was born in Bethesda, Maryland, and his frontier wisdom came from a country track. The gallery laughing not with him but at him, a sound he'd never had to hear before because on Fox News the audience always laughed with him. The disaster relief section. They didn't have offsets for the water in their living rooms. A line so simple it could fit on a bumper sticker, which is exactly why it would travel, the poker chips line. You talk about children like they're poker chips. You put them on the table when you need to change the subject, and you sweep them off when someone else's children need help. That one would get shared by every parent who'd ever watched a politician use kids as rhetorical shields. And the final question, the yes or no that got neither a yes nor a no, just 45 seconds of a man realizing he'd locked himself in a room 4 years ago and thrown away the key. That clip wouldn't need a caption. The silence said everything. That last one would be the one that lasted. Not because it was the angriest moment, or the funniest, or the most dramatic, but because it was the truest. It showed in real time what happens when a man's entire identity is built on never apologizing. Eventually, you reach a moment where the right thing to do is obvious and you can't do it. Because doing it would mean admitting that the person you've been pretending to be doesn't exist. But Crockett wasn't thinking about clips. She was thinking about Grace Meng. She was thinking about a congresswoman who had stood at this very dais 4 years ago, her voice breaking, and said, "You don't have to put a bullseye on the back of Asian Americans across this country." Who had asked through tears for the most basic thing a person can ask, "Stop making my people targets," and who had been met with, "No apologies." Today, 4 years later, someone had finally made Roy sit in this room and answer for that moment. Not on Fox News, where the audience was already on his side, not on Twitter, where he could craft his response and hit send. In a hearing room, under oath, with cameras rolling and no commercial break, and he still couldn't say he was wrong. That was the thing about men like Chip Roy. They didn't change. They couldn't. The brand was the man and the man was the brand, and both were built on the principle that backing down ever from anything for any reason was weakness, so they kept doubling down. On the rope comment, on blocking disaster relief, on voting against protecting kidnapped children, on every position they'd ever taken, no matter how ugly, because admitting one mistake meant the whole edifice might crack. Roy would go on Fox tonight and say Crockett ambushed him. He'd send a fundraising email with no apologies in the subject line. He'd tweet something defiant. His base would love it. They always did. But something had shifted today. Not in Roy. Roy would never shift. That was his whole thing. The foundation of his brand, immovable, unapologetic, never give an inch. It had made him famous. It had made him powerful. And today it had made him a man who couldn't answer a yes or no question because his own stubbornness had sealed every exit. What shifted was the room, the people watching, the record. Because now, permanently in the congressional record, there was a moment where a man was asked the simplest question about the simplest moral principle. Was it appropriate to talk about lynching at a hearing for murdered women? And he couldn't answer. Not wouldn't, couldn't. Because his entire identity depended on never saying he was wrong, and the truth required exactly that. And that was the thing about men like Chip Roy, the aggressive ones, the ones who built careers on doubling down. They were different from the quiet evaders, the Johnson types who shrank and stammered and eventually went silent. Roy wouldn't shrink. He'd get louder, he'd get angrier. He'd turn the hearing into proof of his own persecution and sell it by the yard. But the volume wouldn't change what happened. It wouldn't change the names Crockett read. 6 women dead, their hearing hijacked by a man quoting country lyrics about rope. It wouldn't change the 11 days Texas families spent waiting for disaster relief that one man blocked. It wouldn't change the 20,000 Ukrainian children he couldn't be bothered to protect on paper. It wouldn't change the leaked recording where he said in his own voice that his job was chaos. The noise would cover it for a while. Fox would help, Twitter would help, the fundraising emails would help, but the question would keep surfacing in debates and interviews and town halls for as long as Roy stayed in public life. Was it appropriate? And every time he'd have the same 2 options, say yes and sound monstrous, or say no and admit he'd been wrong for 4 years. And every time he'd choose the third option, the non-answer, the redirect, the pivot to the border or the debt or the radical left. The escape hatch that wasn't really an escape, just a delay. The paint was still wet and Roy was still standing in the corner, and now everyone could see it. Crockett pushed back from the desk and stood up. She gathered her folders, the timelines, the transcripts, the vote tallies, the names of 6 women who had been dead for 4 years and whose killer had been convicted, but whose memory had never gotten a straight answer from the man who used their hearing to talk about rope. She tucked the folders under her arm and walked out. The hallway was already crowded. Cameras, reporters, staffers, the permanent low hum of the Capitol machine processing another day's worth of theater and consequence. Someone called her name. She kept walking. Not because she was avoiding them, but because she wasn't finished thinking. And the thought was important enough to finish. She was thinking about the word justice. Roy used it constantly. It was in his floor speeches, his press releases, his campaign ads, his opening statements. Justice for Texans, justice for victims, justice for the American people. The word was load-bearing in everything he built. Without it, the rope comment was just a threat. Without it, blocking disaster relief was just cruelty. Without it, voting against protecting kidnapped children was just indifference. Justice was the magic word that transformed all of it into principle. But today, for 30 minutes, someone had asked what the word actually meant when Roy said it, and the answer, it turned out, was nothing. It meant nothing. It was decoration, a coat of paint on a house with no foundation, justice for Texans, unless those Texans needed disaster relief, justice for children, unless those children were Ukrainian, justice for victims, unless those victims were Asian American women whose hearing you hijacked to talk about rope. The word was empty. Roy had hollowed it out through years of overuse and misapplication until it was just a sound he made, a verbal tick, a rhetorical crutch. a thing he said before and after doing whatever he was going to do anyway. And the cruelest irony, the one time someone asked him a genuine question about justice, was it appropriate? He couldn't answer. Because answering would have required the word to mean something, and it didn't, not to him, not anymore, maybe not ever. Behind her, the hearing room was already emptying, the story was already being written, Roy was already composing his tweet. But the question was still hanging in the air unanswered. Was it appropriate? He said he meant it. He said, no apologies, fine. But now everyone saw what he meant, and now everyone knew what he wasn't apologizing for. What happens when justice is just a word someone uses to justify cruelty? What happens when the children are just props in someone else's political theater? What happens when the tough guy from Texas is really a kid from the DC suburbs, quoting country songs and calling it frontier wisdom? We just watched it happen. He said he meant it. He said, no apologies. The question is whether the rest of us are willing to accept that, or whether we're finally ready to demand,